The morning light poured through lace curtains that fluttered in the faint summer breeze, casting shifting patterns of shadow and gold across the hardwood floor. Maya Ellison sat at her small oak dining table, papers neatly stacked in front of her, a mug of black coffee steaming at her side. The house smelled faintly of lavender from the candles she always lit in the mornings, a ritual that brought her calm before stepping into the storm of academia. For Maya, mornings were a kind of prayer, a chance to anchor herself in silence before stepping into a world that so often tried to define her by its own narrow terms. She adjusted her glasses, leaning closer to the paper she was grading. Her pen hovered, then tapped lightly against the margin. The handwriting was messy, rushed, but full of heart. She smiled despite herself, jotting down a note of encouragement instead of criticism. That was her way, seeing potential where others saw only imperfection. Her students often said she was more than a professor. She was someone who believed in them before they believed in themselves. Across the room, the faint clatter of dishes reminded her she wasn't alone. Her niece, Talia, padded barefoot into the kitchen, hair tangled in morning knots, wearing the oversized Spellman sweatshirt Maya had given her when she got into college. "You're up early," Maya said, her voice softened with affection. "Couldn't sleep," Talia mumbled, reaching for a glass of water. She leaned against the counter, watching her aunt in the quiet, almost meditative rhythm of her work. "Don't you ever get tired of grading papers?" Maya chuckled, shaking her head. "This is the easy part. It's the meetings, the politics, the constant proving. That's what tires me." Her words carried a weight she hadn't meant to place on them, but she didn't take them back. Truth had become her companion in recent years, even in its heaviest forms. Talia tilted her head, studying her aunt. "But you love it, right? Teaching." "I love the teaching," Maya corrected gently. The rest I endure." For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the rustle of paper and the ticking of the kitchen clock. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that settled between people who knew each other's wounds and still sat close. Later, Maya drove across town in her old but well-kept Honda, the radio humming low with a Nina Simone track. The city unfolded around her, brick row houses with peeling paint, kids running down sidewalks with backpacks, shop owners pulling up gates to greet the day. She greeted the security guard at the university with a nod and a smile, though his eyes slid past her, searching for someone else. She noticed, as always, but chose not to let it pierce her. The campus was waking, a river of students moving between lecture halls, their chatter a tide of anticipation and weariness. Maya loved these mornings most of all, the freshness of possibility before the weight of the day settled in. As she walked across the quad, a few students waved. One ran up to her, breathless with excitement, clutching a draft of an essay. "Professor Ellison, do you have a minute?" Maya's eyes softened. She always had a minute. She crouched slightly, so their eyes met at level, and took the paper. "Walk with me," she said. They did, falling into easy step. The sky above was clear, blue stretching without interruption, but Maya couldn't shake the small knot of unease she felt pressing at the edges of her piece. She brushed it away, focusing instead on the laughter of her students and the way the sun caught on the leaves overhead. She had no reason to suspect that this day, this ordinary golden morning, would be the one to test the very foundation of her dignity and strength. The faculty meeting room smelled faintly of stale coffee and floor polish, its long oak table polished to a shine that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. The walls were lined with framed photographs of past university presidents, all white men in tailored suits, their eyes gazing down with a kind of permanence that made Maya's presence feel both an act of defiance and survival. She chose a seat near the middle of the table, unassuming, her leather-bound notebook neatly placed in front of her. Around her, colleagues filed in, laughing in clipped tones, their conversations dotted with references to golf outings, private schools, and summer homes at the lake. Their voices never softened when she entered. If anything, they sharpened. Low jokes exchanged just loud enough for her to catch a fragment, just enough to remind her where they thought she stood. "Morning," Maya offered, her tone warm, controlled. A few nods answered. Most kept their eyes on their phones or papers. At the head of the table, Dr. Victor Langford, the department chair, adjusted his cufflinks before clearing his throat. He was a man who carried his authority like a crown, every gesture deliberate, every pause calculated to remind others of their place. As we all know, Victor began, his voice smooth but carrying an edge, the administration has raised concerns about the tenor of some of our classes. They want assurance that we're focusing on scholarship, not, shall we say, unnecessary controversy. His eyes flicked, quick and precise, toward Maya before sweeping across the room. The message was clear. Maya kept her expression steady, her pen poised over her notebook, though she had no intention of writing. She had grown skilled at reading what was unsaid. The discomfort with her curriculum on race, the quiet resentment when her students left her class with sharpened questions instead of softened obedience. One colleague, Dr. Harris, cleared his throat. It's not just about controversy, Victor. There's also the question of tone. Some students have reported feeling, what was the phrase, called out or uncomfortable. He said the last word as though it were poison. His gaze, too, slid toward Maya. She felt the knot of unease tighten in her chest, but forced her body to remain composed. She leaned back slightly in her chair, folded her hands in her lap, choosing silence. She knew that silence, wielded correctly, could be more disarming than words. Victor smiled, that politician's smile that never reached his eyes. Of course, we want our classrooms to be spaces of inquiry, not spaces of division. I trust everyone here understands the difference. A murmur of agreement rippled around the table. Maya kept her gaze fixed on her notebook, but her mind was racing. Division, she thought. They always dress discomfort as division, truth as threat. When the meeting ended, chairs scraped against the floor and the chatter resumed. Maya gathered her things quietly, slipping her notebook into her bag. As she rose, she felt a presence at her shoulder. You might consider adjusting your syllabus, Harris said softly, though the softness was its own kind of blade. Some of the administration is beginning to ask whether certain courses are more trouble than they're worth. Maya met his eyes then, steady, unwavering. Knowledge is always trouble for someone, she said simply. Then she walked out, leaving his frown suspended in the stale air of the room. Outside, the campus sun seemed almost too bright, the air too sharp. Students streamed past, unaware of the invisible battles being fought in those panel rooms. Maya walked slowly across the quad, each step deliberate, her breath measured. She could feel the hostility tightening its net, threads woven in whispers and glances, but she also felt something else, an old, familiar fire stirring within her. She thought of her niece, of the students who rushed to her after class, their faces lit with questions, with hope. She thought of the weight of those photographs on the wall, and how much space they refused to make for her. And she knew then, as the wind lifted the edges of her jacket, that the storm was not approaching. It had already begun. It happened on a Wednesday, in the middle of her seminar on constitutional law. The classroom windows rattled faintly from the autumn wind, and the smell of chalk dust mixed with the faint aroma of coffee from students' cups. Maya was at the blackboard, her handwriting sharp and deliberate as she underlined the words, Equal Protection Clause. Her students leaned forward, engaged, their notebooks filled with hurried scribbles. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. Professor Johnson, how does this apply when the law itself was designed to exclude? Maya turned, her eyes softening. That's the question, isn't it? The Constitution promises equality, but the practice... The door burst open. 2 campus security officers stepped inside, their navy uniforms crisp, radios buzzing at their belts. The sudden intrusion cut the room into silence, the hum of thought collapsing into stillness. Maya's chalk slipped from her fingers, tapping softly against the floor. Professor Johnson? One officer asked, his voice clipped, official. She straightened, her chest tightening though her expression remained calm. Yes. We've received a report. You'll need to come with us. A murmur rippled through the students, disbelief, confusion. Maya glanced at them, then back at the officers. On what grounds? She asked, her voice measured, precise. The taller officer shifted uncomfortably. You've been accused of creating a hostile environment. We've been directed to escort you to the dean's office immediately. Hostile environment. The words rang like a gavel, heavy and hollow. She felt the eyes of her students pressing into her, searching her face for a cue on how to respond. Maya inhaled slowly, grounding herself. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. "I'll come," she said, reaching calmly for a bag. Her movements were deliberate, each one a refusal to be rushed, to be diminished. "Professor," one student started, his voice breaking. Maya lifted her hand gently, a silent reassurance. "Continue the discussion without me," she told them. Her voice steady though her throat felt raw. "Remember what we spoke about. Truth requires patience." The officers flanked her as she stepped into the hallway. Students from other classes peered out of doorways, whispers chasing her down the corridor. To them, it looked like an arrest. That was the point. In the dean's office, she was made to sit in a hard chair across from a wide mahogany desk. Dean Caro, a man with a face as expressionless as marble, leafed through a folder as if she were already a case file. "Professor Johnson," he began, not looking at her, "several complaints have been lodged against your teaching. Students report feeling targeted, uncomfortable. Your approach has been described as inflammatory." Maya sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. "I teach constitutional law. Discomfort is part of the learning process. That is not hostility." Caro finally lifted his eyes, cold, assessing. "Be that as it may, perception is reality in these matters. For now, you're suspended, effective immediately, pending review." The words landed like stones in her stomach. Suspended, stripped, in an instant, of her classroom, her platform, her students' trust. She felt the weight of it pressing on her chest. But she did not bow. "Is this truly about perception," she asked quietly, "or about silencing what you don't want heard?" Caro's jaw tightened, but he did not answer. He closed the folder with a snap, signaling the conversation was over. Escorted once more by security, Maya walked out into the open air. The autumn wind whipped her coat around her legs. Students were already gathering, phones raised, their eyes wide with outrage, with fear, with questions. Someone whispered her name, and then another. Her face, her dignity, her silence, all of it was being recorded, captured, shared. Maya kept walking, her chin high, though her heart thundered. She knew then that this was no longer a matter of faculty politics. It was a public act of erasure, and what was made public could no longer be hidden. The injustice had found its stage. That night, Maya sat at her kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. The day's events replayed in her mind, each detail sharp as glass. The click of the dean's folder, the whispers in the hall, the sting of being escorted out like a criminal. Her tea had long gone cold, but she cupped it anyway, the ceramic grounding her, reminding her she was still here, still solid. On the table beside her lay a stack of unopened mail. She pulled one envelope toward her, ripping it open absent-mindedly. Inside was an old photograph she had requested months ago from the archives of the Civil Rights Museum. It showed a younger Maya, barely in her 20s, standing at the steps of a courthouse in Alabama. Her hair was pulled back tight, her posture firm, and in her hand was a legal brief that would later help overturn a discriminatory housing policy. She traced the edges of the photo, remembering the heat of that day, the sweat under her collar, the weight of expectation in the air. People had forgotten that part of her life, or maybe she had let them. To her students, she was just Professor Johnson, meticulous, even-tempered, the one who stayed late to review essays. Few knew she had once stood shoulder to shoulder with activists, filing motions that rattled entire city councils. Her phone buzzed, breaking the memory. It was Lena, a former student who now worked as a journalist. "Professor, I saw what happened today," Lena said, her voice low, urgent. "They're trying to frame this as misconduct, but people are already talking. Some of your old cases are resurfacing online." Maya pressed the phone tighter to her ear. "Cases?" "Yes," Lena said. "The housing reform case. The police accountability suit in '98. They're finding out who you really are." Maya leaned back, the weight of it all pressing against her ribs. She had wanted a quieter life when she joined the university, a chance to teach without always fighting. But history doesn't dissolve. It waits. The next morning, when Maya stepped out her apartment building, she found a small crowd gathered on the sidewalk. Students, neighbors, even strangers held up printed articles and old photographs. One student called out, "Professor, is it true you took on the city back in the 90s?" Her instinct was to retreat, to keep her life divided, but she stopped, turned toward them. "Yes," she said simply. "I fought then just as I'm fighting now. The methods changed, but the struggle—" She let the sentence hang, her eyes scanning their faces. "The struggle is the same." A hush fell, the kind of silence that carried respect. Cameras clicked, pens scratched against notepads. Maya didn't offer them anger or even rhetoric. She offered them memory, proof that her current ordeal was part of something larger, something woven through decades of labor and resistance. And in doing so, she shifted the frame. She was no longer a professor accused of hostility, but a veteran of justice battles, one with scars and victories to prove it. Later that afternoon, Lena sent her a link. A video compilation was circulating online, splicing footage from that day in Alabama with cell phone clips of Maya being escorted out her classroom. The caption read, "They tried to silence her then. They're trying again now." Watching it, Maya felt both exposed and fortified. She hadn't planned to become a symbol again. But sometimes symbols aren't chosen. They're revealed, called back into the light when the times demand it. She set the phone down and closed her eyes. The fight had already shifted. The dean, the officers, the institution. They thought they were dealing with a professor to be disciplined. What they didn't realize was that they had just resurrected a litigator who had once toppled walls with nothing more than patience, paper, and truth. And she still knew how to wield all three. By the end of the week, the university's quiet brick quad had become something else entirely. News vans lined the curb, their satellite dishes rising like steel trees against the gray morning sky. Reporters with clipped voices rehearsed into microphones, while camera operators panned across clusters of students holding handmade signs. Maya stood for U.S. We stand for her. Truth over power. Education, not erasure. The words were scrawled in black marker, hurried but fierce. Maya stood just inside the tall glass doors of the humanities building, watching. Her reflection looked back at her, a calm face, but with the faint circles of sleepless nights beneath her eyes. She felt Lena's presence beside her before she spoke. "They're not here for spectacle," Lena said softly. "They're here because they see themselves in you." Maya adjusted the strap of her leather satchel, the one she had carried since her early days in law. "Or because they smell blood," she murmured. Outside, the crowd swelled as another chant rose up, carried by dozens of voices. The sound was not angry, not reckless, but steady, like water against stone. It had all started 2 days earlier, when Lena published her first piece. Professor Johnson's Fight is not new, a legacy of justice in the classroom and the courts. It was equal parts biography and exposé, tracing Maya's past legal victories while questioning the motives of the university's sudden crackdown. The article caught fire online, drawing national outlets into the story. Soon, clips of Maya's removal were paired with old photos of her civil rights work, and hashtags spread across platforms. But exposure brought risk. That same morning, Maya had opened her email to a flood of messages. Words of encouragement, invitations to speak, former clients reaching out to thank her. Buried among them were darker notes. Anonymous senders. Threats wrapped in casual cruelty. "Stay in your lane, Professor. We know where you live." She had read them without flinching, then closed her laptop and left them unanswered. Fear had power only when you gave it space. Now, as she pushed through the building doors and stepped into the open air, the crowd quieted. Dozens of eyes turned toward her. Cameras shifted. For a moment, the weight of expectation pressed down so hard she thought her knees might buckle. But then a student, one of her freshmen, a boy who had barely raised his voice in class, lifted his sign higher and shouted, "We believe you, Professor." The words cracked something open. She smiled, small but steady, and walked forward until she stood on the steps above them all. "I see you," she said, her voice carried without a microphone. "And I thank you. This is not about me alone. This is about every student who has been silenced, every worker dismissed, every truth buried because it was inconvenient for those in power." The cheer that followed was raw, rising like a tide. Reporters scribbled furiously. Recorders held high. Later, in the dim glow of her apartment, Maya watched the news clips on her phone. Footage of the rally was already on national broadcasts, spliced with commentary from pundits. Some praised her courage. Others framed her as disruptive, a relic of old battles who should have stayed in retirement. She scrolled past it all until a message from an unfamiliar number caught her eye. "We need to talk. I have documents you'll want to see." Attached was a single file name, University Disciplinary Records, sealed. Her pulse quickened. If the message was real, if the documents revealed what she suspected, that the administration had quietly targeted faculty of color for years, then this fight was about to escalate beyond anything the dean had anticipated. She closed the phone, exhaled slowly, and let her gaze drift toward the window. Outside, the city hummed, alive with both danger and possibility. For the first time since the confrontation, Maya felt the balance tipping. Not toward safety, but toward truth. And truth, she knew, could shake even the tallest towers. The documents arrived at dawn, slipped through encrypted channels by a whistleblower who signed only with the initials J.D. Maya sat at her kitchen table in the half-light, the smell of strong coffee curling upward, her glasses perched low on her nose. The file unfolded across her screen, pages of disciplinary records, memos, confidential emails. Each one sang the same pattern. Faculty of color scrutinized for minor infractions, denied tenure, forced out under vague pretexts. White colleagues with worse records faced little more than a quiet conversation and a warning. Her hands did not tremble, though her chest tightened with the weight of it. Years of suspicion, whispers from colleagues who had quietly packed their offices after policy disputes, the subtle disappearances that no one dared question. It was all there, preserved in digital ink. By mid-morning, she had called in Lena and her former colleague, Raymond Ellis, a civil rights attorney turned policy advocate. They sat across from her in the cramped living room, stacks of printouts between them. "This is systemic," Raymond said, running a hand over his shaved head. His voice was low, deliberate, not isolated incidents. "This is a pattern, a deliberate strategy." Lena leaned forward, her eyes sharp, her notebook already filling with shorthand. "And now you can prove it." Maya tapped the papers, her voice calm. "Proof means nothing if it isn't used wisely. We don't leak all at once. We build a case, file suit, force them to answer under oath." She leaned back, recalling nights spent in packed courtrooms decades earlier, standing firm against police departments that claimed innocence while records told another story. She had learned then, justice wasn't just about truth. It was about timing, precision, pressure. The first move came quietly. Raymond filed an injunction in federal court, naming the university for systemic discrimination. The filing alone sent ripples through the campus. Whispers in the faculty lounge turned to nervous silence. Administrators began locking their office doors earlier than usual. The second move was strategic disclosure. Lena published an article that didn't name the whistleblower but outlined just enough of the records to spark outrage. She included testimonies from former professors, voices that had been erased but were now ready to speak. Their words bled across the page. "I was told my research wasn't aligned with the university's image. They warned me I was too visible at student protests." The article caught fire. By evening, it trended across platforms, sparking debates on national news. Some anchors treated it with grave seriousness. Others dismissed it as identity politics. But the seed was planted, and the administration could no longer pretend Maya's fight was personal. The dean's response came swiftly. A polished statement, read in clipped tones at a press conference, painted the university as a victim of mischaracterizations and selective leaks. Cameras captured the smug half-smile, the dismissive wave of the hand. But Maya had anticipated it. That same night, she and Raymond released a second batch of records, timed to coincide with the morning news cycle. This time, They included internal emails between the dean and board members. The language was damning, subtle but unmistakable references to maintaining a certain standard and protecting the university's profile. By dawn, the story had shifted again. The dean's face appeared not as a defender of tradition, but as the architect of something ugly, deliberate, and undeniable. Maya watched it unfold from her living room, her coffee cooling beside her. She felt no triumph, only steadiness. Each step forward meant greater risk. She knew the backlash would come harder now. Calls from powerful donors, threats of countersuits, perhaps even attempts to discredit her past. But she was ready. She had chosen restraint, strategy, and patience. She was not fighting for her career anymore. She was fighting for the young faces who had chanted her name on the quad, for the silenced voices in the files, for the truth that institutions had tried to bury. Her eyes moved to the window, where the city's skyline caught the pale morning sun. The towers still stood tall, gleaming, but she knew now they could be shaken, and she intended to shake them. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and old paper, a place designed to carry authority like incense. Sunlight streamed in narrow beams to the high windows, catching flecks of dust that hung in the still air. Rows of spectators filled the benches, students clutching handmade signs, journalists with recorders poised. Faculty would whisper their support, but now sat silently, their eyes fixed on the proceedings. Maya stood at the plaintiff's table, her spine straight, her hands resting lightly on a folder of notes she hardly needed to read. Raymond stood beside her, suit sharp, voice measured. Across the aisle, the dean sat stiff in a dark blazer, flanked by lawyers whose cufflinks glinted under the lights. His expression was practiced calm, but his jaw betrayed tension, tightening each time Maya's name was spoken aloud. The judge entered, robe trailing like a shadow, and the murmurs in the gallery fell away. The gavel cracked once, echoing through the room. Raymond began with precision. He laid out the records methodically. Tenure denials, disciplinary memos, coded phrases that carried weight far beyond their words. Each piece of evidence was projected on the courtroom screen, magnified for all to see. The document spoke louder than outrage ever could. The dean's attorneys countered with polished deflection. They painted the policies as standardized procedures, the disparities as unfortunate but coincidental. They accused Maya of orchestrating a smear campaign, of twisting the institution's good intentions into malice. Through it all, Maya remained still, her gaze steady. She knew her turn would come. When it did, the silence in the room deepened. She stepped forward to the witness stand, the click of her heels against the tile like a drumbeat. She swore her oath, sat and faced the courtroom, not just the lawyers, but the community gathered behind them. The questioning began gently, Raymond guiding her through the events. The confrontation in the faculty lounge, the whispered threats, the documents slipped to her in the night. She answered each with clarity, her voice carrying not bitterness but conviction. Then came the cross-examination. The dean's attorney leaned forward, his tone dripping with condescension. "Dr. Carter, isn't it true that you've had disagreements with university leadership before? That you've been considered, what's the word, difficult?" Maya's lips curved slightly, not into a smile but into resolve. "If by difficult you mean unwilling to accept discrimination as policy, then yes, I've been difficult." A ripple of sound moved through the courtroom, half gasp, half applause, quickly hushed by the judge's gavel. The lawyer pressed on. "And these records you presented, how can we be certain they weren't taken out of context? Policies must be interpreted with discretion." Maya's eyes sharpened. She gestured toward the screen, where an email glowed in large font. "Then perhaps you can explain the context of this message, where the dean refers to maintaining a profile of tradition and ensuring that activist elements do not secure tenure. What discretion justifies that?" The lawyer faltered, shuffling papers. The dean's jaw clenched tighter. Raymond rose smoothly. No further questions. The judge leaned forward, hands folded. This court will take a brief recess before closing arguments. As the gavel struck, the gallery erupted, not in chaos, but in a swell of voices. Some shouted Maya's name, others demanded accountability. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment when the veneer cracked and the institution's polished defenses began to crumble. Maya remained seated at the stand, her hands folded in her lap. For the first time since the fight began, she allowed herself a slow breath. She wasn't finished, not yet, but she knew the balance had shifted. The truth was no longer buried in files or whispered in hallways. It was spoken aloud, etched into the record, undeniable before the eyes of all who had chosen to watch. And for the first time, the dean's face betrayed it. Not just strain, but fear. Maya walked slowly across the quad one late afternoon, the fading sun spilling gold across the stone pathways. The autumn breeze tugged at her coat, and she paused beneath the statue of a former university founder whose name had long been synonymous with exclusion. Students had wrapped the base with banners now, bright fabric painted with words like equity, justice. Truth lies here. The statue seemed less imposing, less permanent, its pedestal softened by color. Her phone buzzed. Another message, this one from a student she'd never taught. Thank you for fighting for us. Messages like that had been arriving daily. Emails, notes slipped under her office door. Faces she passed who offered a nod of gratitude. Some were quiet, almost embarrassed, but their meaning was unmistakable. They had seen her stand in a storm without breaking, and in that endurance, they saw a path forward for themselves. Raymond joined her at the statue, his jacket slung over one arm. He said nothing at first, just stood beside her, watching the students moving across the lawn. Finally, he asked, "You ever think about leaving all this behind? After what they put you through?" Maya let the question hang. She looked at the buildings, grand, old, heavy with history. "I did," she admitted, "more than once. But then I remember my grandmother. She cleaned houses so I could sit in classrooms like these. Walking away would mean letting them claim what she gave her life for. And I can't do that." Raymond nodded, the quiet kind of respect that didn't need words. Later that week, she stood at a podium in the packed auditorium, not as plaintiff or defendant, but as teacher. The seats overflowed with students, colleagues, even strangers in the community who had followed her case. Cameras lined the back wall, but Maya focused on the rows of faces lit by anticipation. She spoke not of victory, but of endurance. She reminded them that truth is not a single moment in court, but a constant choice, made again and again in classrooms, in offices, in whispered conversations where silence once ruled. Her voice carried steady, not triumphant, but resolute. "The system doesn't change in one ruling," she told them. "It changes when each of you refuses to look away. When you insist on fairness, not just for yourself, but for the person who stands next to you." The room erupted in applause, the kind that swelled like a wave and lingered long after she stepped away from a microphone. That night, back in her apartment, she sat by the window as rain traced patterns on the glass. She thought of her grandmother's hands, rough with years of work, and of the students whose futures were just beginning. She thought of the dean's face, pale under courtroom lights, and of the judge's gavel striking not just wood but history itself. For the first time in months, Maya let herself exhale fully. She had not won everything. She had not undone centuries. But she had broken something open, carved space where silence had once lived. And as she sat in the dim light, the city humming beyond the glass, she understood. The fight was not over, but it was no longer hers alone. The torch had passed, burning brighter in the hands of those who had watched her stand.